A hard freeze had come to Staunton, Virginia 3 days before Thanksgiving, dropping the temperature to 19 degrees by 7 in the morning. And Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Hale was driving back from a hardware run on Route 250 when he saw the notice taped to the front door of the old Greer farmhouse and pulled over without. The seething too. In the passenger seat, Scout went still, not the relaxed stillness of a dog at rest, but the particular stillness of a dog that has redirected every sense it possesses toward a single point. Through the windshield, an elderly woman stood on the porch, in a house dress and slippers, reading the notice with both hands. And even from 40 feet away, in the gray November light, Thomas could see that her hands were shaking. What that Marine found when he climbed into that attic 2 hours later would surface a secret that had been hidden in plain sight for 22 years. And prove in front of every person who had chosen to believe the paperwork over the woman that the law and the truth are not always the same document. If stories about people who go looking when everyone else looks away matter to you, subscribe before we go any further. There are more of them, and they deserve to be told. Thomas Hale had joined the Marines at 20 because of a fire. Not a metaphorical fire, an actual one, a house fire on his street in Waynesboro, Virginia, when he was 17. And the way the volunteer firefighters had moved through it. Coordinated, deliberate, without the kind of noise that fear makes in people who haven't trained past it. He had watched from the sidewalk, with the specific attention of a person who has just understood something about what he wants to be. And 3 years later, he had been that thing, or close enough that the distance was instructional rather than discouraging. He had served 14 years across 2 deployments in Iraq and 1 in Helmand Province. And he had come home the last time to Staunton, which was where his mother lived and where he had grown up, and which had the particular quality of a place that has been the right size for a long time and knows it. It was 34. He worked part-time for a county veteran services office and spent the rest of his time doing the kind of general contracting work that Staunton's older housing stock generated. In steady supply, rot repairs, foundation checks, the slow structural work of keeping old things standing. He was good at it. It had a tolerance for confined spaces and a patience for the work that revealed itself slowly, which were 2 traits that overlapped considerably between the work he had done overseas and the work he did now. It had not come home entirely clean of what he had seen. He slept light. He drove routes he had memorized. On the nights when the weight of certain memories pressed in, not nightmares exactly, more like a specific gravity that had no off switch, he sat at the kitchen table and worked through whatever project he had running, because work required attention, and attention was the only reliable way he had found to redirect himself. He had not told anyone this. He had not needed to. Scout was a Labrador mix, 4 years old, yellow with 1 dark ear that gave him a permanently quizzical look, as if the world were slightly more interesting than he had been led to expect. It had come to Thomas through a veteran placement program, matched after a 2-week assessment, and the match had been obvious to both of them inside of a day. Scout was not a complicated dog. It had 3 settings: working, watching, and asleep. In working mode, he was focused and tireless. In watching mode, he was still in the way that only dogs who take their observations seriously are still, reading a room the way Thomas read a structure, looking for the things that didn't fit. When he found something that didn't fit, he went to it and stayed. Off duty, he slept across Thomas's feet, which made getting up in the night inconvenient, and which Thomas had never once asked him to stop doing, because the weight of it was a thing he had come to rely on, in the way you rely on things you didn't know you needed until they were there. The Greer farmhouse sat on a 12-acre parcel off Route 250, about 2 miles east of Staunton Center, on a rise that in summer was visible from the road through a gap in the tree line. Thomas had driven past it most of his life. He knew the house the way you know the landmarks of a hometown, not with attention, but with the passive familiarity of a thing that had always been in its place. He had not known, until this morning, who currently lived there. He parked behind a mailbox and got out. Scout came with him, no command needed. The woman on the porch had not moved. She was still holding the notice with both hands, reading it, or perhaps rereading it, the way a person reads something they are hoping will change meaning on the 4th pass. She was old, specifically, precisely old, white-haired, slight, wearing a house dress printed with small blue flowers that was entirely wrong for 19 degrees, and slippers that had soaked through at the toes from the frost on the porch boards. She did not look up when Thomas came up the porch steps. She said, without looking up, "It says I have 30 days." Thomas said, "May I?" She handed him the notice. It was a standard Virginia unlawful detainer form, properly formatted, signed by a property management company out of Charlottesville called Shenandoah Residential Holdings. It cited non-payment of rent for the previous 3 months and invoked the standard 30-day vacancy provision. Everything about the document was correct in the way that documents produced by people who know how to produce documents are correct. The right form, the right language, the right signatures in the right places. Thomas read it twice. He folded it and held it. He looked at the house. He looked at the woman. "When did you stop paying rent?" he said. She looked at him for the first time. Her eyes were the pale blue of old denim, and they had the expression of someone who has just been asked the question she has been waiting for someone to ask. "I have never stopped paying rent," she said. "Not in 52 years. Her name was Agnes Greer, and she was 81 years old, and she had lived in the farmhouse on Route 250 since 1971, which was the year she and her husband, Leonard, had bought it from the original owners for $14,000 and a handshake and a promise to keep the old apple orchard in the South Field producing, which they had done for 40 years until Leonard's back made it impossible, and Agnes had done it alone for 3 years after that, before finally letting it go to grass. She had raised 2 children in that house, a daughter named Pauline who lived in Richmond and who called on Sundays, and a son named Gerald, who did not call, and who had not called in 7 years for reasons that Agnes described only as his choices, in a tone that closed the subject before it could open. She had been a bookkeeper, 30 years for the same accounting firm in Staunton, a firm that had been bought twice since she retired, but whose original senior partner, a man named Arthur Finley, had told her at her retirement party in 2004 that she was the most precise person he had ever employed, and that the firm's perfect audit record for 3 decades had less to do with him than with her, which was entirely true, and which Agnes had received with the particular composure of someone who already knew it. Leonard had died in 2015 of the slow kind of cancer that gives you time to say everything and then takes you anyway, and Agnes had been alone in the farmhouse since. She still drove. She still kept the house. She still maintained a ledger, handwritten in the green-covered composition books she had used for 30 years, of every expense and payment she had made since Leonard died, because that was how her mind worked, because precision was not a professional habit, but a personal one, and because she had known, at some level she could not have articulated, that the record would matter someday. The property had been sold in 2019. She had received a letter from the estate of a man she did not know, a distanta relativo of the original sellers, who had inherited a portion of the deed through a chain of transfers Agnes had never been party to, informing her that the property had been acquired by Shenandoah Residential Holdings and that her tenancy would continue under the same terms. Rent to be paid by check to a new address in Charlottesville. She had updated her records and continued paying. On time, every month, by check, with the check number and amount recorded in the green composition book. For 4 years. The checks had cleared. Every one. She had the bank statements. The thought that had been growing in Thomas's mind since he read the word known payment in the notice was becoming something more specific. "Do you have the bank statements here?" he said. Agnes sighed. "I have everything. I have had everything since 1971. She said it the way she said everything, without emphasis, as a simple statement of what was true. "Come inside. It's cold." Scout was already at the door. "Have you ever known someone like Agnes? Someone who kept every record, paid every bill, did everything the right way for 50 years, and still found a notice on their door? If that person is still in your life, sit with them after this. If they're not, tell me about them in the comments. They deserve more than silence." The kitchen of the farmhouse was the kitchen of a house that had been kept with the care of someone who understood that maintenance is a form of love. The counters were clean. The window over the sink had a pot of African violets on the sill that were not dying. There was a green composition book on the kitchen table, open to the current month, with columns of figures in a handwriting so regular and small it looked typeset. Agnes made coffee without asking if he wanted any. which he did. She put the current composition book in front of him and went to a cabinet under the counter and came back with a cardboard box that had been labeled in the same precise handwriting. Shenandoah Holdings, Payments, 2019. Present. Inside the box were 47 checks, 47 carbon copies, each with a date, a check number, and an amount. Each amount matched an entry in the composition book. Each carbon was clipped to a bank statement that showed the check clearing within 3 to 5 business days. Every check had cleared. Not one of them had been cashed by Shenandoah Residential Holdings. Thomas turned 3 pages of bank statements. The pattern was there on every one. The check cleared Thomas's bank, Agnes's bank, meaning it had been deposited somewhere. But when he looked at the payee line on the carbons and compared it to what a cleared check typically showed in a statement, something was wrong. The statements showed the funds leaving Agnes's account. They did not show Shenandoah Residential Holdings receiving them. That was unusual enough to stop on. Mrs. Greer, Thomas said, did anyone ever give you updated banking instructions? A new account number? A new address for the checks? Agnes sighed. In 2021, a man called. He said they'd changed their bank and gave me a new routing number for the payment portal. She paused. I don't use portals. I write checks. A-side checks were fine. Did he give you a name? He said his name was Mr. Harlan. He had called twice before about routine things. I had no reason to question him. Thomas was very still. Scout, who had been moving through the kitchen with the unhurried interest of a dog cataloging a space, stopped at the doorway to the back hallway. It turned his head and looked at Thomas. Thomas looked back. Scout went down the hallway. The attic hatch was at the end of the hallway, in the ceiling above a pull cord that Agnes said had been there as long as she had. Scout sat directly beneath it and looked up. Thomas pulled the cord. The hatch opened. The folding ladder came down. It climbed. The attic of the Greer farmhouse was the attic of a house built in 1921, which meant low rafters and wide plank floors, and 100 years of accumulated useful things. Leonard's woodworking tools in an oilcloth case, Christmas boxes stacked with a labeling system that Agnes had clearly invented and which made complete sense once you understood it. A steamer trunk with brass fittings that had belonged to Leonard's mother, and at the far end, under the slope of the roof nearest the south wall, a wooden filing cabinet, 3 drawers, unlocked. That did not belong to the 100-year-old accumulation of a family's life. It was newer, clean, recently placed. Thomas opened the top drawer. Inside was a folder. Inside the folder were 47 receipts. Each received was stamped "Received in red," with a date and a signature. The dates corresponded exactly to the dates on Agnes's carbon copies. The amounts corresponded exactly to the amounts Agnes had paid. The signature on every receipt was not Shenandoah Residential Holdings. It was a name Thomas did not recognize. It stood in the attic of the Greer farmhouse in 19-degree air that came through the roof boards in thin, cold lines. And he understood what he was looking at with the particular clarity that comes when a scattered set of facts assembles itself into a single shape. Someone had been intercepting Agnes Greer's rent checks for at least 2 years, diverting them, keeping the receipts, proof of payment that Agnes never knew existed, in an attic she had no reason to access, and using the accumulated non-payment to construct an eviction that on paper looked entirely legitimate. He climbed back down. Scout was at the base of the ladder. They put his chin on Thomas's boot for exactly 1 second, then stepped back, which was the dog's specific way of marking a moment he recognized as significant. Agnes was at the kitchen table with her hands around her coffee cup. She looked at Thomas's face. "You found something," she said. "I need to make a call," Thomas said. "And then I need you to tell me everything you know about who handles this property locally." Agnes sighed. "His name is Wade Harlan. He has an office on Beverly Street." But the real weight of what Thomas had found, the part that would change everything he thought he understood about what had been done to Agnes Greer, hadn't surfaced yet. The call was to a woman named Catherine Doyle, a real estate attorney in Staunton whom Thomas had worked with twice on title issues for renovation properties, and who had the specific combination of methodical intelligence and genuine outrage at injustice that made her, in Thomas's experience, exactly the right person for exactly this situation. Ed read her the eviction notice. He described the filing cabinet. He described the receipts. He read her the name on the receipts. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thomas, What is the full name on the property deed? Thomas did not have the deed. Agnes did. It took 3 minutes to retrieve it from the same cabinet under the counter that had held the payment box. Thomas read the name on it to Catherine. Catherine sighed. Give me 2 hours. What she found in those 2 hours in the Augusta County property records and the state corporate registry and one phone call to a title company she used for research was this. Shenandoah Residential Holdings had been dissolved as a corporate entity in April of 2022, 18 months ago. Its registered agent at the time of dissolution was Wade Harlan. The property, which had been transferred to the holding company in 2019, had not been properly transferred out of it when the company dissolved. In Virginia, when a company that holds real property dissolves without properly conveying that property, the title enters a legally ambiguous status. It did not mean Agnes owned the property, but it meant that Shenandoah Residential Holdings had no legal standing to issue an eviction notice, because Shenandoah Residential Holdings no longer existed. The eviction notice was issued by a company that had been legally dead for 18 months. Wade Harlan had been collecting rent, or more precisely, intercepting it and keeping it, in the name of an entity that no longer existed, with eviction as the endgame, once enough non-payment had accumulated to make the case on paper. If you were in Thomas Hale's position right now, standing in that kitchen with those bank statements and those receipts and Catherine Doyle's voice on the phone, would you have gone further? Would you have stayed? Type yes or no in the comments. He already knew his answer. He had known it since Scout stopped under that attic hatch. Thomas called a man named Ray Alcott, who had served in his unit in Helmand and who had come home to Staunton and become a sheriff's deputy. And who answered, on the second ring, the way people answer when they recognize a number they trust. Thomas described the situation in the precise, sequential way he had learned to describe situations that required someone else to act on them. Ray sighed. I can be at Beverly Street in 40 minutes. Then Thomas sat back down at the kitchen table with Agnes Greer and her coffee and her green composition book, and he told her what Catherine had found. And Agnes listened with the stillness of a woman hearing something she had suspected without being able to prove. And when he finished, she put her hands flat on the table and pressed down. And she did not look away. Wade Harlan came to the farmhouse the following morning. He drove a white F-250, and he came with the comfortable authority of a man who had been doing the thing for long enough that he had stopped imagining it would be challenged. He knocked twice, opened the storm door without waiting, and stepped into the kitchen as though entering a space he managed, which until yesterday he had believed he did. Thomas was at the table. Catherine Doyle was beside him with a legal pad. Ray Alcott was in the corner in his deputy's uniform with his hands at his sides and the expression of a man who has already decided how this goes. Scout was between the kitchen table and the door. Harlan looked at Scout. Scout looked back. The sound that came from Scout was not loud. It was low and continuous and entirely settled. Not a warning, but a position. The growl of a dog that has already made its assessment and is communicating it without ambiguity. He did not move. He did not need to. His body, placed where it was, said everything that needed saying about who was welcome in this room and who was being evaluated. Harlan looked at Ray. He looked at Catherine. He looked at Thomas. He sighed, I'm here about the notice. There's clearly been some misunderstanding. Agnes said, from where she sat at the head of her own table, in the kitchen she had kept for 52 years, show me where my checks went. 6 words. No anger in them. No performance. The question of a woman who kept records and knew how to use them. The room was entirely still. Scout's growl did not stop. Thomas set the filing cabinet folder on the table. He set the 47 carbons beside it. He set the bank statements, the ones showing every check clearing, every payment leaving Agnes's account, in a third stack. He set Catherine's printout from the state corporate registry on top. Shenandoah Residential Holdings, dissolved April 2020. 2. Registered agent Wade Harlan. He sighed, in a voice that asked nothing and stated everything. The entity that issued this eviction notice has been dissolved for 18 months. The checks Mrs. Greer paid in good faith cleared her account and were received. These receipts confirm that, but not by the entity named on her lease. The receipts in that cabinet are in your handwriting, Mr. Harlan. They were placed in an attic that Mrs. Greer had no reason to access. The gap between what she paid and what a dissolved company cannot legally claim is the legal basis for this eviction. And it isn't a gap, It's a plan. Harlan's comfortable authority had the quality in that moment of a structure that has failed at a single load-bearing point. The rest of the surface held for a moment by habit. Then it didn't. He looked at the receipts. He looked at his own handwriting. He looked at the door. Scout took one step toward him. Not fast. Deliberate. The growl did not change in pitch or volume. It was simply there, and closer. Harlan did not take a step. Rye sighed. Mr. Harlan, I have questions for you. You can answer them here, or we can do this differently. He said it the way men say things when the outcome is already decided and the only variable is the path to it. Harlan sat down. Scout did not relax until the door finally closed behind him. 37 minutes later. Then he walked to Agnes's chair and put his head in her lap, unhurried, and stayed there. And she put both hands on him and did not say anything, and the kitchen was warm and quiet and entirely hers. What came after moved the way justice moves when the documentation is thorough and the attorney is prepared and the deputy has a case that holds. Catherine filed a motion to void the exception notice on the grounds that the issuing entity had no legal standing. The court granted it in 11 days. The Augusta County Commonwealth's attorney opened a fraud investigation into Wade Harlan's management of dissolved corporate assets. 2 other properties in the county with similar eviction histories were identified and their tenants contacted. Both were elderly. Both had kept their records. Agnes Greer was never asked to leave the farmhouse on Route 250. There are moments that feel less like a legal outcome and more like a thing returning to its right place. Thomas came back the following Saturday to fix the porch railing, which had been loose for 2 seasons, and which, Agnes pointed out, Leonard would have fixed the autumn it first went. They worked through the morning in the cold and the clear November light. Aunt Agnes brought out coffee and a particular kind of spiced apple cake that she said she had been making since 1974, from a recipe that had never been written down, because she had made it often enough that writing it down felt redundant. Thomas ate 2 pieces and did not pretend he was going to stop at 1. At some point, a scout found a patch of weak sun on the porch boards and collapsed into it with the total commitment of a dog that considers warmth a professional priority. Agnes watched him for a moment and said, "He's the one who found it." The cabinet. Thomas said, "He always finds the thing I haven't looked at yet." She looked at the south field where the apple orchard had been, the one she and Leonard had kept for 40 years, the grass now brown and still under the frost. She sighed. Leonard would have said God sent you. Thomas did not answer immediately. He fit the last post into its bracket and pressed it firm. "I'll take the dog's credit," he said. She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, short and sudden and completely unguarded, the laugh of a woman who had not had much cause for it lately and was surprised to find she still had it. It had not come to Staunton looking for this. He had come back for his mother and for the work, and for the particular steadiness of a place that had been the right size for a long time and knew it. He had not planned to pull over on Route 250. He had not planned to stay. Scout had stopped walking. That was enough. That had always been enough. This story is for every person who kept every receipt, paid every bill, and still found the system built against them. And for the ones who looked anyway, who went up the ladder when there was no order to. Is there an Agnes in your life? Someone who did everything right for decades, who kept the records and held the line and still had someone try to take what was theirs? Tell me about them in the comments. Let this section be full of people who deserved better than they got and found it anyway. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here for the next one. There are more of them waiting. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.